We've got, and sorry if I say this wrong, Sava, we've got Sava Kurdemelidis and Jocelyn Pearl. So the format of this is meant to be quite an informal sort of group chat. The idea is each of our three amazing guests will have 5 minutes to talk about their work, so you can get an idea of like what they're working on, what they're interested in, and I'll give a bit of an intro to each of them beforehand as well. And then we'll move on to like an open and shared discussion among all of us. So it's not necessarily meant to be like a panel, so please do just unmute yourself if you want to say or add anything or ask any questions, but you can also type in the chat as well. And I realized last time I didn't actually introduce myself, so maybe I should introduce myself as well this time. So I'm Sarah Hamburg, and I did Kernel, I think it's Kernel Block 3 last spring. Before that, I was a neuroscientist. I did cognitive neuroscience, and then I went into tech. And then, yeah, Kernel was like my entry point to sort of full-time Web3 last year. And I've been doing various things in the DeSci space ever since, and meeting so many incredible DeSci people. So it's really exciting that we have the Kernel DeSci Guild now. And yeah, long may it continue. So yes, without further ado, I'll introduce our guests. So I've got a little bio for each of the three, and then I'll give you each 5 minutes to talk a bit more about your work. So no particular order. Isabel is a product leader with a background in strategy, startup investment, and market research. She's currently product lead at LabDAO, which is creating an open source science innovation network. Prior to LabDAO, she has 8 years experience in the research space, which includes Molecule, Oxford University Press, and Holt Sprink, who are the parent company of Springer Nature and Digital Science. And also she's been a long-term supporter of DeSci, proper DeSci OG, I think we can say. So she actually attended the first Blockchain for Science conference back in 2018. So it's great to have you here, Isabel. Sava is a commercial/IP consultant, legal counsel, and a New Zealand and Australian patent and trademark attorney with over 18 years of experience. He conducted his LLM thesis on alternatives to the patent system for developing medicines, and he's also founded crowdfunded cures to establish an impact market for unmonopolizable therapies. He also advises on various different DeSci projects, including VitaDAO, Molecule, SciDAO, and LabDAO on IP. And then last but not least, we are joined by Jocelyn. So Jocelyn Pearl, she's a biotech scientist, podcaster, and company builder. She hosts the Lady Scientist podcast, as well as the Ultra Rare the podcast, which is a show where she explores the concept of decentralized science. She also co-founded LabDAO, an open source science community, which I'm sure we'll hear a bit more about on this call. And she also has a PhD in molecular and cellular biology from the University of Washington. So thank you for joining us, guys. And so I guess I'll hand it over to each of you in turn. I don't know if anyone has a preference of who goes first. Maybe I'll just do it in the same order that I introed you at. I think that makes sense. So Isabel, would you like to take the first 5 minutes? And apologies if I cut you off after 5 minutes. It's just, but I won't cut you off, obviously. I'm not that rude. I'll just maybe give you a polite, cool. Okay, so Isabel, do you want to take the mic? You're on mute, sorry.
Indeed. Yes, I wasn't prepared specifically to give an overview for 5 minutes of my work, but I can give you a bit of a background to some of the projects that I'm working on. Anything that I miss or reinterpret about LabDAO, luckily we've got Jocelyn, who's actually a co-founder of LabDAO, who can flesh out any additional pieces. I've only been there 3 weeks. So I'll start with LabDAO, which I think is a great example of tackling both the problems of traditional science, which is what spurs the space of DeSci's reaction to some of the challenges that run throughout the scientific space, and some of the problems it's addressing and how it's looking at solving them. So, I mean, the problems, I would need more than 5 minutes to go through the problems of science, and these were sort of addressed in the meta science call last week as well. But some of the core, I think, that's running through LabDAO, driven very much by Nicholas, a frustrated scientist and inventor himself, is, if you're a talented scientist, sparking ideas all the time, and we don't have good methods for allowing people to flexibly test, get a proof of concept test in the wet lab. A lot of ideas that a scientist may have. They're often like very restrained, working extremely long hours in academia, often for the first 10 years of their career, subject to, working on projects that maybe not their #1 priority, but something that's a lab's priority. And, Nicholas himself, he was tinkering with some ideas, did the computational biology part, honed down on a particular area that he wanted to take forward, and then was like, oh my God, there's no way for me to like just run these like 5 experiments that I want to in a wet lab. And he like hit this wall. And it's just one example of how I think our current system stymies researchers who might have 100 ideas and maybe only one of them's good, or maybe only 1 in 1,000 people has a breakthrough idea. But we don't have good channels for those people to even get to the point of seeing if it is a good idea. Like I say, there's many reasons why people can be held down from exploring some of the things that they want to. To give a bit of a summary of LabDAO, the overarching ethos, I think, is to birth a new form of scientific institution, one that is more inclusive and freeing, and that you could do world-class science simply from a laptop as an individual. It's got 3 buckets that we're putting effort into. The first one is tools, the second one is teams, and the third one is funding. And how I like to think of it is that if you break down some of the services that a university or or really any R&D organization comes down to like, have you got the people? So that's the teams bit. Can the people do any work? Well, that's the tools bit. And then have they got any money to do the work? And that's the funds bit. Obviously, that's a big vision, a big plan. It would take a lot to create all those things. So we're going to do one step at a time. And where we're starting is looking at some of the complexity that goes into doing computational biology. Computational biology, you've got biologists who are not often trained in, to have much formal training in code, or, often it's getting a bit better, but people are often self-taught and hacking things together piecemeal on a daily basis. But then you've also got these people who are trained in, machine learning or statistics and much more, advanced computational methods. And then they're thinking, can I apply my skills into computational biology part? And both sides find it incredibly complex to have the type of impact that they want. A lot of the tools look like they were built in the 90s, and that's because they were built in the 90s. The UX is awful. There's not a good way of like finding, discovering, and starting these tools. And so we'll be launching an alpha in a couple of weeks, actually, of the first version, which is a CLI, much improved interface for dealing with things like RNA-seq, BLAST, and some other very core computational biology applications. So depending on how much on the biology biotech side we want to dig into, we can go into more on that, or we can head more into the meta science piece. I've probably had my 5 minutes. That's LabDAO. Very happy to talk about my past experience as well, which I won't do now. But I will say that I started in academic research, publication, so Oxford University Press, realized that all the problems that starts to create with unintentionally by really good people for the science space. Went to Holtzbrinck, which is the parent company of Springer Nature and Digital Science, because at the time, I was back in 2017, it felt like the single organization that had the most potential to impact and change how the space worked, and the scientific incubator Digital Science tries to do that. But it was there that I first learned about decentralized science, and I think that has the biggest potential for impact of all. So looking forward to discussing some of that with you today.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Isabel. That's such a fascinating background. Okay, on to Sava next. I think that was you were second, if that's okay.
Yeah, no worries. Yeah, hi guys. So yeah, my background is sort of got into this more on the IP side, but I'm a commercial IP lawyer, and I've worked mainly for tech companies sort of over most of my career. But I got into crypto a few years ago, mainly through my family. They're sort of more the techie people, and I kind of the little brother, as it were, kind of just taking advantage of things. But on that side, got into ICOs, and then more recently the DeSci side of things, because yeah, I've got a lot of for me personally as well. I kind of did postgrad bio back in at uni, but I realized that bio wasn't really a good career option, and it was there was a lot of barriers to kind of actually getting out there, particularly in New Zealand. I mean, I think there's really only like a few places in the world where you could do well in bio. It's probably like maybe sort of Cambridge, Oxford, Boston, San Diego, something like that. But the rest of the world, and then on that side of things, you're very much stuck and pigeonholed in like, how are you going to create some sort of new patentable drug and enforce a monopoly price or potentially, there's obviously applications in medical devices and things like that, but a lot of the biotech, molecular biology is mainly looking at medicines and treatments. And so, yeah, sort of share a lot of the frustrations that, say, Nicholas was talking about. And in my mind, like the most important kind of public good is almost like health, really. I mean, what's more important than health? And and crypto, I think, is really a way to address a lot of these problems with market failures with public good funding, and particularly looking at places where the big bad kind of intellectual property doesn't work properly and might cause market failures, and things like patent thickets and all those things that people don't really like about intellectual property. But that's kind of what led me, when I did my master's, I was kind of I mean, I'm not anti-IP. I think that IP has a problem, and there's a lot of issues around that. But I'm more thinking like, okay, how can we really address like the gaps in IP? Because there are a lot of, I think personally, a lot of benefits to having intellectual property. When you've spent millions and millions of dollars on making a product, if somebody can go and just copy it and basically take all that benefit, then there's no market then to generate those things. So having IP is a good thing in my mind, but it needs to be proportionate and reasonable. However, there are areas where essentially you can't enforce a monopoly price, and so things like looking at supplements, off-patent drugs, diets, plant medicines, psychedelics, lifestyle interventions, and for that reason, I think there's not a lot of money that flows into these very important areas. There's a lot of scientists and researchers that are really interested in these areas, and things like personalized medicine. I mean, the whole pharma industry isn't incentivized to basically look at personalized medicine approaches, because they are trying to sell as much of their patented drug as possible, whichever drug has the most patents, not necessarily like the best treatments. We don't incentivize treating patients. So I think crypto has a lot of really non-trivial use cases for fixing a lot of these market failures and sort of fixing these incentives. And that's and that's particularly something we're interested in through crowdfunded cures, which is essentially like looking at using prizes as an alternative to patents as a kind of private incentive. So there's a lot of problems with just public funding. I think people recognize that public funding is just there's a lot of perverse incentives as a scientist, that once you receive a grant, you're pretty much like, I mean, I've heard this said anecdotally also on the science side, that you're not incentivized so much to actually deliver results, because as soon as you deliver the result, you kind of shut down the money, as it were. So you kind of more incentivized just to keep asking for money. So there's a lot of good things about this kind of startup mentality and the fast fail approach and things like that. But we've got to kind of balance that with making sure that people have equal opportunities and stuff. But yeah, I'm really bullish about the idea of using prizes as a kind of or more sophisticated, in the sense of these things called impact markets, and basically where essentially you pay for impact and you pay for data and the generation of data, useful data, say clinical trial data, but then that could go to like just publishing papers that are replicable and things like that. But yeah, one of the main issues is like, how do we measure impact? And personally, I think things like clinical trials are very structured ways to measure impact. Like we can tell if something is statistically significant. That means it sort of has a low chance of being just due to chance, say 5% just due to chance. And we can get things statistically significant to a level of like 1,000,000 to 1. So there's definitely ways of using, say, randomized controlled trials and structured ways of basically testing things to get very reliable data, which then we can use to essentially create massive global impact. So that's that's the area that I'm really focused on. But I think in general that looking at crypto and the benefits of crypto is mainly around like crowdfunding and basically generating like money out of nothing almost. And if we can create, if we can get like pictures of apes worth $3 billion, I think we can get people to fund scientists. And scientists shouldn't have to beg for money from a grant funding that's not going to come, or has like 10% chance of success, or has, on the other side, they have to kind of basically throw away their principles and just chase patentable drugs and pushing drugs on people. So
thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you. That was amazing. Okay, and we've had some really good questions in the chat, which we'll come back to afterwards. But first of all, we're going to hear from Jocelyn next, if that's okay.
Yeah, and I'll just say some of the points Sava brought up are, I think, some of the more exciting ideas and conversations that are happening in this space, especially, the idea that patent reform or ways of ameliorating the issues from IP to allow for higher impact of, some of these drugs that we don't necessarily have the answers for, or people aren't incentivized to move forward with delivering to patients. I think that's really an exciting space. So yeah, I guess my background, I'm trained kind of traditionally within, academia, similar to Sarah. My PhD was in systems biology and neuroscience, and understanding transcription factors in brain diseases. And I was struck, like many during their PhD, by some of the challenges of the academic field as a whole, some of the shortcomings of the training process and the career prospects, but also, how much research was not getting funded as a result of waning NIH funding, and the challenge of getting grants, and just how much, potential progress there was that wasn't really being met. In particular, my passion is specifically in the neurologic disease space, where, yesterday, big announcement, the third drug for ALS was just approved by the FDA. And, so many of these neurodegenerative diseases, we just have no treatment for, despite a really solid understanding of the biology. So I initially was kind of interested in crowdfunding of science, which at the time, this was back in 2015, didn't really have a lot of traction. There were a few patient communities that, patients tend to have to find creative solutions to move forward their science, and that's always been the case. And I think the DeSci space has learned a lot from some of these communities, and that's why we're seeing traction with projects like Vibe Bio, where they're planning on putting together the infrastructure to allow patients to spin up their own DAOs and manage their own drug assets, and develop drugs in a way that's, I would say, more fair than how it's been done, where typically you're giving away the ownership of the data you're generating, and the drugs that you're developing, to a company. And it's kind of unfair for all of the work that these patient communities have put into it. And really, at the end of the day, it's for them. Sorry, this is getting to be kind of a ramble. So yeah, I guess, like, there's all these issues that have, arise as a result of science happening in these two institutions, if you will, which is academia and industry. And biotech or biopharma has a very specific incentivization structure as well. And they're going to develop drugs in a very specific way for a certain type of patient population. So there's all this stuff in the middle that isn't happening. And how do we incentivize that, and how do we build systems that allow for broader access, or allow for anybody to work on science if they want to. Like I'm really inspired by, I think somebody mentioned the citizen science communities and these DIY bio communities that have become much more prevalent. And there's some really interesting examples more on the technology side and hardware side of, people, amateur technologists building and inventing things that are now used in labs. So yeah, I'm really inspired by these different movements, and I think DeSci for me became a place where I was getting to have conversations with people across many different projects, and just unpacking all of these ideas and thinking about how we could use Web3 infrastructure, or even the principles of Web3 to advance some of the challenges in science. So that's kind of a long ramble, but I'm happy to get into whatever we want to get into today. So
Amazing. Thank you so much, Jocelyn. Thank you, guys. It's really interesting hearing about all your different work. One of the questions which came through early, which maybe we'll move to, was from Research Rabbit, interested in how digital science are viewing Web3. So yeah, Isabel, do you maybe want to give us a bit of an overview if you have an opinion on that? Can we count on being super innovative when it comes to innovating in science? It's a good question.
That's a great question. Yeah, so as far as I know, and I'm meeting with the director of strategy and investment, my old manager, next week, so I may have a more up to date. If anyone's really interested, they can message me. I'll have a more up to date next comment next time we speak. But as far as I know, they are interested. From Stefan von Holtzbrinck himself is very interested in the topic, which is one of the reasons you see Springer Nature as the who's been supporting the latest Gitcoin grant. They were one of the people in the matching pool. So yes, they're looking at it, they're aware of it. I know people in the management team who have been investors in crypto for quite a long time. As far as I know, they haven't done any particular investments or pieces of product work in the Web3 space yet. However, one of their founders there, Mark Hannor, who's just great. I don't know if anyone knows Mark. He set up a Web3 company separate from digital science called genomes.io, and that's about the really great example of being able of where blockchain technologies can be useful, allowing people to sequence their data but then completely own that data and not allow pharma companies to be able to ask you to pay for their increasing data bank, for example. So I can pop a link to that in the chat. In terms of being super innovative, people may or may not be interested in the specifics of digital science, but there are some amazing, really smart people there who have been, interested in the problems in science and how to fix them for, well over a decade. The CEO, Daniel Hook, has, put together and been working towards a different way, basically, of rebuilding the research paper. Everyone knows the problems with the current research paper, static PDFs, being based on code, but that code isn't reproducible. So they've got a lot of really interesting projects that they're incubating and supporting that work on different parts of this problem. And Daniel's view of the stack, as it were, which I saw back, I don't know, years ago now, is now very similar to actually what DeSci Nodes is building on top, on a new Web3 stack. So people have a view of the same problem and then different ways to solve it. So yeah, I won't take too much more time on digital science specifically, but I'd be very happy to chat to anyone. So just reach out if someone wants to go into more detail about them and the different ways of solving the same overarching problems.
Oh, thank you. Research Rabbit, you had a few other questions. You may want to unmute yourself and pick one or two of these to surface to the group. If you can unmute yourself, that is.
Hello, good morning. Can everybody hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Hi. So I just basically had a question. I'd love to get your opinions on this. So academia, we all believe is broken, or the endeavor of science is broken for a variety of reasons. And I think there's this assumption that if we make certain changes, it unlocks a tremendous amount of opportunity, a lot of ideas, a lot of experimentation, and a lot of advancement into whether it's new drug discoveries or human knowledge or whatever it may be. And I think my question is, how might we measure the current dead weight loss? How do we measure what we are missing? Or how do y'all think about that? Because obviously there might be more, just because there's volume of experimentation and conversation and whatever it may mean, does not necessarily mean there's going to be volume of like tangible impact or things that move the needle. And of course, how you think about that or how you measure that. So basically that, like, what is unlocked and how do we measure the potential opportunity, if that makes sense?
I'd love to kind of sort of have a go at that one, because it was sort of on the topic of my thesis, and that's what I try to kind of measure. So the problem is it's this invisible problem. It's a little bit like economic experiments where you don't have a natural experiment to kind of compare, or like, you know, what's the difference? What's better than, you know, capitalism, or what's better than, you know, I mean, we don't have a lot of natural experiments, but the issue is that I think it just makes sense, logical sense from a first principles perspective, that a lot of research, if it's not profitable, it's not going to get funded. And if it doesn't get funded, then it never leaves the bench. So we never find out. So it's kind of this invisible problem. So what happens is that a lot of this, you know, say you've got the treatment for ALS or whatever, and it's a great treatment, but you publish your paper and no one can get a patent on it. Or it's a generic drug, or it's a supplement, or it's some sort of dietary intervention. You won't get the funding. I mean, you might get sort of some funding through grants, but you won't get any kind of private funding if you can't enforce a monopoly price. And so these no-go decisions are being made all the time. And anecdotally, like say technology transfer officers will talk about it, and pharma companies might talk about it, but a lot of the decisions are made kind of behind closed doors. There's a lot of secrecy in the industry, and they don't really collect that data, you know, no-go decisions based on like poor commercialization or IP protection. So I tried to kind of reach out, you know, when my thesis, I sent like 200 emails to people. I got some sort of cryptic responses, but no one's really measuring this data. So I think it's sort of from first principles, it could be amazing, you know, and it could be this kind of crazy, horrible Holocaust and people, you know, like dying unnecessarily. But unfortunately, it's very difficult to measure because it's like, you know, we don't have a kind of counterfactual or whatever, however you'd call it.
Yeah, just to add to that, I think a lot of science is generally hard to measure, like, and a lot of basic research is very incremental today. And I guess that's part of why for me my focus tends to be more within this biotech space and drug development space of developing treatments for, you know, diseases that people are suffering from that I believe, you know, we should have treatments for. Like one of the examples I come back to is Huntington's disease, which, you know, was one of the first diseases, I think might be the disease that was first described genetically and clinically over 30 years ago, and yet we still have no treatment that halts the progression of this disease. So, you know, within those spaces of drug development, it's a little bit easier to measure, like, whether or not we have now an approved drug or not, whether or not there's patient impact. But outside of that, I think it is a little bit harder to measure. Regardless, I think even without a way of measuring it, there's something that feels inherently right about allowing anyone to pursue scientific knowledge if they want to and have access to that. And I think like I mentioned, we've seen examples of that accelerating human progress as a whole, with things like, I believe, you know, rocket design or, you know, the AI space or robotics with like Opentrons is a good example. So, you know, I personally believe that like building communities of collective intelligence, allowing people to like access the information they need to like make the connections or connect the dots will move forward human progress.
It's also like an interesting side note on this question, Rabbit, is that like the question of measurements is an interesting one, and one that is deeply applicable to scientists. And asking this question of like, how do we measure what is currently invisible, can lead us to like very interesting insights about the types of work that we might think about doing and what we might enable. But another approach, which seems to me equally fruitful, if not more so, is thinking about like the medium in which these things occur. And what I mean by that is, like I've been following the DeepMind data sets quite closely, because it is really interesting that you can like now go around and play with how proteins fold in like enormously more powerful ways than was ever previously possible. And you can do the kind of citizen science that you were talking about in another one of your questions from your laptop at home, as Isabel was saying. And this, it reminds me of, back in the early days, there was a project called Folding at Home. I don't know if anybody remembers this. It was a separate chain set up, like kind of parallel to Bitcoin, that used, instead of like proof of work, you would put your computational power to work figuring out how proteins folded. Right? It was prior to like DeepMind's work. And I love that kind of thinking in terms of like, like it's one thing to go and like measure what is invisible and think about how it might be made visible and like valuable within the cultural mainstream. And it's also like concomitant to that, at least, or like perhaps an even more powerful approach, is like, okay, how do we use the properties of these media just to like democratize as much stuff as we can and put the power of participation in people's hands, even this kind of like so-called like passive participation, in the sense of like folding at home, right? Like you didn't have to be a biological expert who knew anything about the shape of proteins. You could just like run your miners on folding at home as opposed to Bitcoin. And that was like an interesting way of like helping to collaborate and advance the sum total of human knowledge, or like add to collective intelligence, even if you yourself didn't know anything about proteins. And I was like, that's cool. I love that, because it's like a clever use of the medium as well, that democratizes knowledge in a further sense than just like requiring, like wider conversations with more experts, which are also necessary, but perhaps the tools give us abilities beyond that too.
Thank you. Research Rabbit, I see you raise your hand if you wanted to just unmute yourself and comment.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for all of those responses. That's all very, very insightful, and love all of it. Very exciting. And when I think about DeSci today, it feels like there's three big buckets, and this is just like broad strokes, so it's going to be wrong. But in general, there's folks who are working on like making academia better, fixing academia, replication, tokens, publishing, persistence, so on and so forth. Then there's this sort of like second bucket, which is, okay, there's knowledge in the academy. How can we commercialize it, offer new paths of funding, DAOs that are essentially VCs, VCs getting into this in funny ways, and so on and so forth. And then there's like this third category, which Jocelyn and Andy, you guys were talking about, which is like citizen science, or like science with a big S for humanity, and like unlocking all of that stuff. And I think my question here is, like, that last one feels like the biggest mission-oriented opportunity for humanity at scale. But how do you even think about the opportunity set there, or the size of what it means to have citizen scientists? Because I don't know, I recently watched a documentary about flat earthers. They're doing a lot of citizen science, and I'm not sure it's productive for humanity to be like, if I can get a rocket from Lab Dao to like fly myself up to see if it's flat or not, that seems like a misallocation of resources, but everyone voted on it. So I'm just trying to understand, like, how do we think about that opportunity set? And maybe the answer is like, look, who knows? It's basic technology like cloud and servers everywhere, and who knows what can unlock. or like AI, but I'd love to understand just how you guys think about the opportunity set for citizen science, science with a big S.
That's a great question. I'm not sure if any of the guests want to take it. By all means, anybody in the group, feel free to jump in any time as well. It does remind me of, I think we did a talk about risks of DeSci, and I think I was talking about how it's only a matter of time before we see astrology DAO and like DAOs for any kind of thing that you can imagine like coming through the door. Like when you open up the door to citizen scientists, it's an absolutely amazing opportunity, but you just don't know who's coming through that door. And I always go back to my mom, and she's very spiritual, and she always tells me, but it was written by a scientist, Sarah. And so even if someone's a scientist, it doesn't necessarily mean that a scientist doesn't necessarily mean that the work they're doing falls into what other people deem science. But I actually think it's an opportunity to look maybe at things which have been on the fringes and people have maybe pushed away, but equally, I think we'll find a balance between maybe like a more transparent balance between science and pseudoscience in the future when everything is testable for everybody. But it's something I'm really interested in. And it also touches on a question we had from Richu in the chat earlier about this idea of how do we involve or hire sort of non-academics? Do people need a PhD to take part in DeSci? So yeah, I'd love to hear other people's thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Almost gets into like the philosophical differences in the democratization of information. And I mean, who's to say like what's a good pursuit versus a, wasteful pursuit, I guess. But sorry, I think that there was something else I had to say about it, but it'll come back to me.
Yeah, I mean, so sorry, oh, no, go on. Okay.
No, you go, Sarah. I think you got there slightly before.
Okay. All right, I'm getting there. Yeah, no, I mean, personally, I think it's all about incentives again, just making sure that we pay people for useful stuff and being able to measure the useful stuff in some way, and then the market will sort of pay for it. And I don't think measuring what we want is kind of an intractable problem. Like we all want more well-being, we all want more health, or we understand what sickness looks like, right? Even if we don't understand what well-being is, we all kind of understand, if you don't have a functional limb, that's a problem. So we can put a sort of, I think there are metrics, and particularly for diseases, like, they're very standardized metrics for like depression, Hamilton Depression Scale, for Crohn's disease, CDAI. All these things we can put metrics on, so we can basically measure what we all want. And then if a citizen scientist comes out and comes up with an amazing treatment and it works and it happens to be crystals, then all of a sudden, I guess crystals is science. If it's like a randomized controlled trial and we've controlled for it, we need to update our physics. But from that's what happens. It's no longer alternative medicine. So I mean, that's great. But I do share the concern about if we don't adequately reward like actual things we can all agree on as useful, and we're just going for this kind of aping in kind of around like buying doing a ridiculous project, like the equivalent of no offense to anyone that invested in Constitution DAO, but like buying a copy of the Constitution or buying a copy of a book, thinking that's going to give you rights over the IP. Yeah, I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. People can do whatever they want with their money, but I think there is a real problem with, particularly, if you get a 30,000 flat earthers together, there's going to be a lot of wasted, inefficient money. But then if that's their money to spend, they should be allowed to do that. But I don't think that we should incentivize that sort of thing.
Yeah, so there's two different topics here, aren't there? One is about quantification and measurement, and the other is about who belongs in the scientific enterprise. I'll start with the quantification one. I mean, this is obviously a huge topic, but if we link it to risks in DeSci, if we compare with DeFi, one of the really exciting, incredible things about DeFi is that you can see all these like live financial transactions. So you're not dependent on quarterly reports anymore to get insight into the success or numbers around a business. This actually, it's one of the pieces that lobbyists for policymakers, use, is that actually it's more transparent. It reduces information asymmetry. Great, but it's also more measurable. And measurement, I think, in science is a huge topic, but two of the things to be very aware of are that many of the biggest problems within science today, I think you can attribute to oversimplistic measurement. The topic of Goodhart's law is obviously very famous within science. As soon as something becomes a measure, it ceases to be a good measure, it becomes a target. And one of my concerns is that you could give a false sense of security over the success of a scientific project just by like the number of people in its DAO or the number of activity on votes it has. Like there'll be things that could be indicators that aren't actually indicators of better science. And if we think about the role of new reputation metrics, they have the potential to be far better than the reputation metrics we have in current science. But of course, we could perfectly within possibility to create a reputation system that's far, far worse than simply publications. One of the distinctions I really like that Jocelyn and Sava made is the difference between like things you can measure in biotechs, like if you can measure that X many fewer people, have decreased life expectancy after taking a particular drug. That's very different from measuring, lead metrics about whether someone happened to be a postdoc in a famous scientist lab and are therefore more likely to have a piece of breakthrough science later. These are the types of metrics that are very unhelpful in the institution. And there's two pieces, that this was really insightful to me that I came across recently. There was a book, I think it's from the 90s, called Trust in Numbers, which is about, essentially why do institutions love quantification so much? And the theory in that book is that it's because it's required by bureaucracies. Like as soon as you get into like really big systems, you need simple measurements in order to, work out which things are better than others. When you're a small group, you can use qualitative research or qualitative methods to assess whether this team member is doing something more worthwhile than another. But if you're an enormous distributed society like a university or a government, very simply, if you're trying to compare two areas that are totally different, you start to lean on what look like very helpful and accurate quantification methods. And this starts to flow into the education system as well. And like, why do people love grades as opposed to individual teacher assessments? And the theory there is that why do we like simple numbers and why do we want to strip away context? It's because information needs to travel well. There needs to be like a simple number that can be shared across the bureaucracy. And also it needs to aggregate easily. You need to be able to pull these numbers together in order to make structural decisions. There's another interesting book related to this as well called Seeing Like a State. And that's also about how like states really like, they need simple numbers in order to make like big, incredibly complex decisions. So anyway, that's a very big topic. For the second piece, I'll answer very briefly on like, do other people without a PhD belong in science? I would like to deeply interrogate anyone who says no. What kind of position would that be to hold? Although of course there are people that do. I mean, I think one of the best examples is programming. Now anyone all over the world can take a whole load of online courses potentially for free, and then within days, certainly if they've been working hard to become a talented programmer, within months they can run state-of-the-art machine learning models and have the capabilities and the right to perform scientific research in the machine learning space. Why not the academic space? And I would love to see much more open, high quality resources that train people to PhD type level, but don't require you to be part of a select group with all its insider biases and selection biases. What might we discover as a society if we made much more of those networks, resources, information and training more publicly accessible?
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. I completely agree with that. I think the whole idea of you need a PhD to do science is sort of counterproductive. I just want to ask Holly, she's had her hand up for quite a while now. Sorry to leave you waiting, Holly. Do you want to unmute yourself and take the mic?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I posted about my friend. Her name is Hannah Davis, and she was a scholar with me at OpenAI several years ago. And she got COVID very early on when New York had that the very first, like bad, where everybody was terribly sick. And so she, after about a month, she was still sick, even though she just had a mild case of COVID. And went to the doctor several times. They ignored her symptoms, and so then over time she started talking about it on Twitter, and began to collect a huge group of people basically who also had the same symptoms. And so since she was, she knew about machine learning and data set collection, they started collecting data with surveys. And they actually got about 3,762 people to respond, and they put together a pretty cool paper, on a volunteer basis, basically. And then they were able to start kind of, talking about it with their doctors. And now they're seeing, I think this was like maybe December of 2020, and so it's just now, you're hearing more and more about it. That it exists. So I think that this is an interesting case in which the person themselves, who was suffering, was able, even with the COVID fog and everything, able to kind of collect these people and get the information and talk about it this way. So I just thought I'd pass that along.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really, yeah, I like the idea of like patient scientists as well. So sort of like participating in science, helping design studies. I mean, we have a lot of sort of patient involvement already, but not it's nearly as much as we could have, and sort of empowering patients to, I can't remember who it is who talks about it, but like, is it Martin, own their own problems, which I think is quite a powerful idea in some ways. So I'm not sure if anyone else has any questions for the group. There's been some really interesting chat, I have to say. Daniel, you've made quite a few comments. I haven't been able to keep up with all of them. Did you have anything that you wanted to put to the group?
Nothing by voice, thank you.
Okay, okay, you can stay in the chat. I think everyone's quite bullish on astrology DAO as well, I have to say.
You've really started something there. I'll just hold up on that. I know that Victor has his hand up, and Jocelyn perhaps would like to respond to some patient communities or other parts of what has been said.
I think
Oh,
Research Rabbit was hold his hand longer. Do you want to ask something?
No, I've been
okay,
talking too much. Victor, please jump in.
Oh, okay, good, no problem. So just want to say, like, I have some bad internet issue. That's why I'm coming to Zoom all the time, because like I get rocked and then I have to come back. But I was like thinking a little bit like about the distribution of knowledge of science in general, because like I have the feeling like in terms of when it comes to university, when you get access to funding, mostly university which get access to funding is like big company which really need scientists to do like the R&D, like for their own interest, maybe automatic vehicle or maybe new new information about science to make sure that the industry is competitive. And also like the idea of citizen science. Well, I think like it would be an interesting way where you onboard more people like who is not really in the academic field, but it is important to educate them in some way why important it is like science and all the benefits it is to benefits them and also like benefits the citizen in some way, because like it will be, because it's so difficult for some people to grasp like the importance of science. And while the big corporate, they have always the money to make sure that the scientists are able to do the R&D, and when the citizens not only be a participant but also be like funding in some way like into the science to make sure that the scientist also has the resources not only from the big company but from the bigger citizen, like in general, like who would need that. It would be interesting, like how can we help these people to be more involved into science so that they don't rely on the big corporate to do all the innovation and be for the people.
Yeah, they're really good points. Actually, Blue's asked in the chat as well about what kind of apps we can build for citizen science as well. Is there anything happening at LabDAO for kind of like tools for citizen science, or is it more for traditional science? And sorry if I've missed that already.
Yeah, that was kind of the original conception of LabDAO, was that we would have this marketplace where, you know, scientists from all over the world who might not have access to a lab could click in and you know, access someone who had the equipment they needed and be able to carry out that experiment through kind of, you know, AWS for science, if you will. I think building that is obviously a huge challenge. So welcome anybody to come into our community on Discord and check out, you know, what some of the teams are working on that Isabel's leading. But yeah, that's kind of the dream, right? Like that somebody, you know, in a random place in the world who wouldn't necessarily have the tools to do the experiment could click in online and carry that out.
Yeah, I'd say that there's different types of citizen science, aren't there? You know, sometimes people by citizen science talk about like a scientist kind of running an experiment and mobilizing, you know, thousands or millions of people to like name the stars or test water in local rivers, and that kind of mobilization of science. And then there's the what if any citizen was empowered to do science. And I think, like Jocelyn says, LabDAO is at least at the moment on the second side. But any of those scientists could do a citizen science project within LabDAO. So it just pyramids from there.
That's very cool. Yeah, I think we're going to see a lot of those sort of like more refi citizen science projects coming through as well. And sort of the crossover between DeSci and refi will be very interesting. Andy says Pyramid DAO. Do you want to elaborate on that, Andy?
Well, what are they, and how are they powering all of those alien ships?
We definitely need a DAO on that. Cool. I don't see anyone else with their hand up, but if anyone has a question, by all means, please unmute yourself. One thing which I wasn't, I guess, oh, sorry, carry on. I don't know who was
I had a question for y'all though, and Sava, this is a clarification. Isabella, a semi-response to. Essentially, like the thought here is that, look, the way we distribute resources today is based on a certain set of metrics, whether it's prestige, H-index, publications, or other type of market-based stuff, like what is the TAM for Alzheimer's or so on in pharma and IP value and blah, blah, blah. And you're right, Isabel, like the point is creating a new way or a new incentivization system in order to distribute resources is very important. And the sort of core issue when it comes to science, one of the key issues is that there's scarcity. Like, unlike software, which is marginal cost zero to type in code today, it costs money to like buy reagents, and like you can't just test batteries because it requires lithium from the ground. Not everyone can build electric vehicles. So there's physical scarcity to solve physical problems in science. And I essentially fear that because Web3 is such a networked, influence-driven space, much of the outcomes or the new metrics of the new currency that moves resources to people and ideas also tends to be influence oriented, as opposed to something a bit more objective in quotes. And what we know about influence is that it can work really well in some cases, CC, you know, Obama and JFK to the moon, but also not so great. Trump has entered the chat, eugenics has entered the chat, and a lot of horrific issues when it comes to just citizenry being influenced to accept ideas, which spread like viruses. So that's sort of my concern when it comes to this notion of like, well, we have scarce resources. It's not going to be marginal zero for the time being. And then the new distribution, if it isn't based on something objective, it becomes Web3 influence, which to me feels very, very scary, and it brings in new gatekeepers. And I don't know if y'all have thoughts about that or initial gut reactions, but would love to understand.
And before you do, we have like 2 minutes left in the call. Unfortunately, this has been an amazing call. So guests, if you want to answer that in maybe like no more than 30 seconds to a minute each, that will be great.
Yeah, huge risk, completely agree. some elements of science can be more marginalized cost, obviously, like computational biology or physics or maths. But that's a really interesting point about thinking about which things cost more and who deserves the resources. This is something that current institutions really struggle with, and they're obsessed with finding like rising stars. I wouldn't want Web3 science to be a total reaction against everything from the existing system. And I think this dovetails really importantly with like another question of like, what does peer review need to look like going forward? And I know there's a bunch of people in this call who are very interested in the role of peer review. How can we make it not a gatekeeper, but how can we ensure high quality ethical science? I know Sarah's interested in like ethical review boards. Where do they sit within a Web3 infrastructure? How do we make sure that science is done ethically, safely, and to a high quality standard? These are questions that sometimes we'll probably rely on existing frameworks until we have something better.
Thank you, Isabel. Jocelyn,
other areas we need to innovate.
Oh, sorry. Jocelyn or Sava, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think that gets into one of the important points that Nate Jacobs has actually been bringing up on Twitter regularly, which is don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, and how much do we diversify from existing institutions. I think I fall, somewhere in the middle there of, I don't want to throw things out completely, but I also think that sometimes you have to build entirely new institutions to change things. So it'll be interesting how that plays out in this space. And I think I love people in this space who are all about connecting with the open science community and the founder-led bio community, and just like really helping people make connections and work together, because if we're all building separate new platforms for scientific publishing, adoption is going to be really hard. Like, we need to start to plug into each other's applications and work together to make something that people can adopt and use, and hopefully improve the scientific ecosystem as a whole.
Thank you very much, Jocelyn. And Sava, did you have anything to add before we finish?
Yeah, just to say, yeah, 100% agree. Objectivity is the key word. I mean, this is what I love about scientists, is that was sort of framework. We don't say we know everything, but we have rules around falsifiability and ways to test hypotheses and things like that, and we should keep that. And it's not about how many people think 1 + 1 is 3. There's some sort of objectivity around it, and we've got a mechanism also to update what we can and test kind of reality. So we always need to kind of have that in mind when designing these systems. So that's why I'm super bullish about like the community, DeSci. I think crypto Web3 needs more scientists, and so it's super cool.
Thank you so much. That was amazing. As always, I think we could talk about this for a very long time. I felt like we've only just scratched the surface. Biotech and DeSci is an absolutely fascinating topic, but unfortunately, we're going to have to end it there. Thank you so much, guys. Thank you for everyone who's joining. I feel like a key takeaway is about community and collaboration. So I think that's you guys. So, well done for coming and discussing biotech today. And next week we have Open Intelligence, and Andy is giving us an outro. Who would have thought? Thank you, Andy.
I'm so inspired by all the British people in this call that we'll go back to some wonderful British summertime film.
Your heart is a heart of gold, mine's just stone, so let's go face the water. Jump right in. And I know understand